Happy Tuesday, everyone, and thank you for joining us on the second edition of this FDA webinar series put on by ESHA Research. We hope you all are enjoying your summer. We certainly are here. For those of you who may be new to ESHA, I know many of you probably know about us and about our programs, but I'd like to give a little bit of background about our company. We're a small company based in Salem, Oregon. We service nutrition analysis needs and provide compliant food and supplement labeling software. We love reading regulations, all of us, every single one of us. The departments here include technical support, sales, nutrition, development, and consulting services and marketing. We're here to help you. Consulting services is here to help with broad data projects or create compliant labels for you, in which case you could just take a nap for the next half an hour. But I'd encourage you to pay attention. So Genesis RRD is our most widely used program. We pride ourselves on staying on top of industry changes, which is what the most up-to-date version of Genesis reflects. That's why so many of you have come to rely on us for your compliance needs. We must remember, however, that Genesis is a tool to help you reach compliance, that only you have the knowledge and the mastery of your own products to follow this through to make sure your product and packaging are in full compliance. We do offer in-depth trainings. We have professional and advanced general trainings where you or a couple people from your company can come join in with other people from around the industry. It's a great place to network and sort of talk through how people are handling these new changes. We also offer on-site training, so if you have multiple people, we can come to your location and provide a customized training based on your products, your processes, and how you use Genesis. We also can do online training if perhaps an on-site or a general training is not up your alley. We can do multiple-hour online trainings that reflect the same type of training that would be taught in an on-site or a general training. And lastly, we do offer a jumpstart training. So for those of you who purchase Genesis and are interested in a short 70 to 90 minute sort of getting started in Genesis, Jumpstart is a great option. Again, this is the second of 3 webinars in our attempt to bring you the most up-to-date and thorough information in a free form. Last time we covered the basic changes and how Genesis has changed to account for these. In our next webinar, we'll cover the best practices for making the transition from the old to the new label and show some more specific documentation to support the new documentation requirements for manufacturers. After that, on September 20th, we will shift gears and focus on our new supplements program. To register for these webinars, you can please visit the website link here listed on this slide. And just as a reminder, this will be recorded and we will be sending out this slide deck for you later to enjoy. Today, we'll cover nutrient changes and an in-depth look. We will start with a RACC change example, move into nutrient and nutrient unit changes, and then we will really spend some time on the 4 hot ticket items, which would be vitamin D, potassium, added sugar, and dietary fiber. We'll answer some of your questions and get back to those that we don't get to. As a reminder, we have a plethora of resources on our website. We're constantly putting out blogs, ebooks, really, really helpful things, and we encourage you to take a look. In current events, we've heard that the USDA has sent the proposed version of their new label in for review. We don't know much at this point, but it is said to potentially closely match the FDA label. So we will keep you abreast of information as more information becomes available. We're continuing to get questions about the timeline of compliance. Keep in mind that the compliance date for companies that make more than $10 million in annual food sales will be 2 years from the effective date. So that would be July 26th, 2018. For companies with less than $10 million in annual food sales, you'll have 3 years, so you'll have until 2019 to make that change. We will continue to have both labels in Genesis, and this is much of what we'll talk about today, trying to navigate between the two, deciding which one to use, and different considerations that need to be taken into account whether or not you're using the new or the old label. First, as I said, we're going to talk a little bit about RACC changes. Now, this would be reference amount customarily consumed, and here are a couple examples. As you can see, we've got carbonated, non-carbonated beverages have now gone to 360 mils or 12 fluid ounces. This is up from 240 mils or 8 fluid ounces before. Breakfast cereals weighing between 20 and 43 grams are now have a RACC of 40 grams, where the old RACC was 30. Fruits used primarily as ingredients, such as avocado. Avocado has been increased to 50 grams compared to the old 30 grams. And a couple other examples listed there for you as well. Yet some more examples here. We've got items such as cake and frosting. It's been determined that we're eating 2 tablespoons is more of a reference amount customarily consumed compared to 35 grams prior. Sugar is 8 grams rather than the old 4 grams. Again, this reflects what the population is consuming, a more realistic idea of what's actually being consumed. I'd like to highlight yogurt. The old RACC for yogurt was 225 grams, and now it's 170 grams. Keeping that in mind, let's talk a little bit about the effect of a RACC change and what that can do to your product. You'll notice here we've got 2 nutrition facts panels. One is with the old here on the left, and the other is with the new regulations on the right. With the old regulation, my 225 gram RACC, so if I had a container that weighed 225 grams, I was getting 20% calcium, which is considered an excellent source of calcium. However, with the RACC change, I'm now looking at 170 grams. Now what's occurred here is I'm actually down to 10%. So I've gone down to a good source of calcium rather than an excellent source of calcium. This is really important to keep in mind, and as you're updating anything to the new label, you must check and see if those RACCs have been updated and alter your serving size accordingly. This is going to could affect nutrient content claims or any other claims that you're making on the package. So be sure to evaluate your entire package when updating labels that have had RACC changes. Let's talk a little bit about some nutrients that have had increases in daily value recommendations. Some examples here, we have dietary fiber, potassium, and calcium. For example, that can help lower blood pressure and reduce the risk for chronic disease. So this, the daily value for this has been increased from 3,500 milligrams to milligrams. Dietary fiber has increased slightly as it is deemed a more important portion of the total carbohydrate makeup. So we've gone from 25 grams to 28 grams of dietary fiber. There is, of course, also a new definition, or it has been defined, and we're going to talk a lot about that today. And then there's some other items that are perhaps a little bit less known, such as magnesium, manganese, vitamin K. Total fat has actually been increased from 65 to 78 grams. There's also been some decreases, and let's talk about a little bit about why these decreases have been taken into account. Sodium, for instance, has gone from 24 milligrams to 23 milligrams. Of course, high sodium intake can be associated with high blood pressure and subsequent risk of heart disease, stroke, and so the FDA, along with the CDC, believe that reducing Americans' intake of sodium can save lives. Total carbs, we've got a decrease in total carbs, and the reason for that is that the percentage of calories contributed by total fat, total carbohydrate, and protein will continue to add up to 100%, but this is in an attempt to make up for the decrease, for the decrease that in the overall DV percentage of total fat. So total fat has increased, as I mentioned before on the previous slide, and because of that, total carbs has actually been decreased as far as what we need to get from that. Another item is biotin that's been decreased from 300 to 30 micrograms. The reason for this is that new scientific evidence is shown that 30 micrograms is an adequate intake for biotin. There's also been new nutrients added and some nutrient changes. Added sugar is a new mandatory nutrient and has a DV of 50 grams. Choline is also a new nutrient with a DV of 550 milligrams. There's also been some unit changes. So vitamin A has gone from international units to RAE, or retinol activity equivalent. Folate has gone from micrograms to DFE. So just a reminder of these changes that we've been talking about for the last couple of webinars. We'll dive into vitamin D a little bit here. So as we know, this used to be voluntary. It is now mandatory, and this is because of in a nationwide food consumption survey, it was shown that Americans are not getting enough vitamin D in their diet. As vitamin D does play a role in bone health, when it's lacking, people can be at an increased risk for chronic disease. There's been a unit change, as we mentioned before, so we've gone from international units to micrograms. Something that is interesting, you can also list the international unit measure of the vitamin D on your label, and that's a voluntary thing that you can do, and Genesis has the ability to do that for you. This can be calculated with a lab. We mentioned that there was a unit conversion, and I'd like to talk a little bit about unit conversions. As we are working through Genesis, the idea and the important thing to keep in mind is that user-entered ingredients will need to be updated by the users. So if it's something that you guys have input and you have a vitamin D value in international units, you'll need to go in and manually make that change. However, for items that are found in the USDA, vitamin D was already populated for many of those. So in this case, we've got a bluefin tuna. It previously had a vitamin D value of 227 international units. The conversion here is that 1 microgram equals 40 international units. So if we divide 227 by 40, we're going to get 5.67 or 5.7 micrograms of vitamin D. And if you look for ESHA item number 17058, this is what you will see there. So as I mentioned before, we had a 227 international unit value for vitamin D, and this has already been populated. Here is 5.7 micrograms. Potassium is another example of one that can be tested for. There's been an increase in this, as I mentioned, from the 3,500 to 4,700, and this can also be, as I mentioned, determined by a lab. Added sugars. As we know, added sugars is a new mandatory label nutrient. A daily recommended value is 50 grams, and it would be 10% of the total calories. Something to keep in mind, which I'm sure you're all aware of, is that sugar can be tested for by a lab, which would be total sugar. It cannot distinguish between naturally occurring sugar and added sugar. That's where you come in. Just to keep in mind, of course, this is how it will look on the label. So we'll have a declaration of total sugars as well as a statement of includes X amount of added sugars with a percent DV. As in many cases, if you'd like to use a simplified label, in order to do that, 8 or more of the mandatory nutrients must be in insignificant amounts, and added sugars would be one of those items that would need to be, that could be low. So for instance, if that were the case, we would have a simplified version, a simplified label, which Genesis can do for you, and at the bottom of this, there would be a statement that would say, not a significant source of added sugars, as well as the other nutrients that are involved in that 8 or more for a simplified label. And an insignificant amount is anything that will round to 0. Let's define added sugars a little bit. So this is what it says. Sugars that are either added during the processing of foods or packaged as such, and includes sugars, free mono and disaccharides, sugars from syrups, and sugars concentrated from fruit or vegetable juices that are in excess of what would be expected from the same volume of 100% fruit or vegetable juice of the same type. Examples we've been given is honey, molasses, corn sweetener, sugar, so any form of sugar. We've got some sort of items that maybe aren't so obvious as before. So beet sugar, dextrose, turbinado, galactose, sucrose, malt sugar, lactose. In some cases, we will talk a little bit more about lactose. Examples of syrup, so high fructose corn syrup, of course, malt syrup, crystalline fructose, maple syrup, and then fruit juice concentrates in some cases. This is how it will look in Genesis. So we've got an example here for honey. As we mentioned before on the last slide, this is definitely going to be one that is considered an added sugar. You can see that this has already been populated, so we've got total sugars at 82.12, and the added sugar is going to be the exact same amount because this is considered an added sugar. So all of this, the honey here is completely considered added sugar in this case. Another example would be something that's a naturally occurring sugar, and this would not be considered added sugar in Genesis. So a banana obviously has natural sugars occurring. Here you'll notice the total sugar has been populated at 12.23, and the added sugar has a 0 value because this is not considered an added sugar. Again, a reminder that any user input ingredients will need to be populated by the user. So if you are using USDA items, berries and things that are obvious, or brown sugars, or anything that's actually beyond the USDA in our database, we have done our best to populate that information in. And we'll continue to work on that and do so with our updates. It's a great reason to stay up to date with your support. So again, just a reminder that the user will definitely have to go in and adjust any ingredients that they have input. I mentioned lactose, and let's talk a little bit about lactose because in some cases lactose will count as an added sugar, in some cases it will not. So I would give you this advice. Well, if you're not sure about if something should be considered an added sugar, let's determine the source and consider how it's being used. So in this example, is it part of a whole food? So milk versus powdered lactose. Milk is a whole ingredient, so the lactose contained in milk is considered naturally occurring and not an added sugar. Excuse me. Powdered lactose, however, which could be added as a sweetener, is an isolated form of lactose and would be considered an added sugar under the new 2016 regulations. Fruit juice concentrate, another very big ticket item. This ingredient may or may not be determined to be added sugar. It's depending on how and in what concentration it is used. For example, if you're adding apple juice concentrate or pear juice concentrate or white grape juice concentrate to a breakfast bar with the intention of providing sweetness, this is using it as an added sugar. However, if you're reconstituting apple juice concentrate to 100% apple juice or less, this would not be considered added sugar on the new label. Keep in mind, we have taken a conservative measure in Genesis and populated all juice concentrates as added sugars. In this scenario, you will need to override added sugar at the recipe level if you determined that it's being used in a way that would not be considered added sugar, such as reconstituting juice to 100% or less. Dietary fiber. So we mentioned this before, we've had an increase from 25 grams to 28 grams. The definition focuses on reporting fiber, soluble and insoluble, that is beneficial to human health. We've got naturally occurring fibers as well as added fibers, isolated or synthetic, that have been determined to be beneficial. Again, lab analysis can test for dietary fiber but cannot distinguish between beneficial or other fibers. So this is where documentation comes into play, because you have the responsibility of determining this in your ingredients in the end. Here are some examples of dietary fiber. So an isolated or synthetic fiber would be, there is a larger list than this, but here are a few. Beta-glucan soluble fiber, psyllium husk, cellulose, guar gum, pectin, locust bean gum, and I'm not going to try to pronounce that. Naturally occurring fibers are things that you'll find in oat bran, beans, berries, nuts and seeds, barley, asparagus. So we're trying to sort of define examples of ingredients that would be determined to be dietary fiber under the new label. And from there, we'll kind of talk about where you need to populate this information in Genesis. If you're working in Genesis and you create a new label, it's possible that you might see something like this. So you might see a null value under the dietary fiber field on the new label. And what's going on there is the program is telling you that there's information lacking. So information has actually not been entered into that field, or the field of every ingredient in your recipe, as this would be based off of a recipe. We've talked before many times about using the spreadsheet report, which can give you examples or show you where you have missing values, and this is really important and a good practice when transferring from the old to the new label. But let's stick on dietary fiber. So in Genesis, we've got in the yellow here, we have our old fiber fields. These used to be just named dietary fiber, soluble fiber, insoluble fiber. These are now named total dietary, total soluble, and total insoluble. Anything that's in these fields here will populate towards the old label. So dietary fiber, if you pull from if you are entered here and you're going for the old label, this is where this program is going to take its information from. These new green fields are new items that we have added. There are actually 6 new fields we have added. What you'll see here is dietary fiber 2016, as well as soluble fiber 2016 and insoluble fiber 2016. These 3 here will pull forward to the new label. So as I mentioned before, the 3 in the yellow will pull forward to the old label, and then these 3, dietary fiber through insoluble fiber 2016, will pull forward to the new label. So as an example here, we have an apple. We have determined that this is naturally occurring fiber, so of course it would count as beneficial and dietary fiber on the new label. So you'll notice that these fields have been populated below. So dietary fiber, total dietary fiber 2.4, and then dietary fiber 2016 is at 2.4. So this is naturally occurring. It's been populated to pull forward to both of the new and the old label. The other soluble fiber fields are going to be for things like inulin. So in our last example, where it was determined that inulin is not beneficial, however, we do still need to document, as we've been mentioning, what we're putting into our food. These fields can be used for documentation. So in that other example, inulin would end up in the other fiber fields here. And this is not going to have any effect. It does not pull forward to the new label because it's not considered dietary fiber. If by chance you're not seeing the new fiber fields, make sure to show all your nutrients by checking this little box, or you can change your nutrients to view. We have in the new program, you're going to have a list of old nutrients to view and a list of new nutrients to view, and a couple in between, mandatory and all. Make sure that you're in the correct nutrients to view, as that will sort of drive throughout the program what you'll see. And as a reminder, to kind of sum it all up, so first of all, think about which label you're working in. If you're in the old label, you're going to go, all fiber fields are entered into, so all fiber, whether it's beneficial, naturally occurring, or other fiber, it's going to be entered into these total dietary fiber fields. If you're in the 2016 label and you're working with naturally occurring fibers such as oat bran, berries, beans, you're going to enter this information into Dietary Fiber 2016 and Soluble Fiber 2016, etc. If you're working in the new label and you're working with beneficial added fibers such as guar gum, pectin, cellulose, you're going to enter this information into the same fields. So that will go again into Dietary Fiber 2016, Soluble Fiber 2016, and Insoluble Fiber 2016. If you are working with the new label and you have something considered other fibers such as inulin, this is going to be entered into the other fiber fields in Genesis. Because we've learned today that it is impossible to decipher certain nutrients such as added sugar versus naturally occurring or beneficial fiber versus non-beneficial, it is important to document, and it has been put forth that it is actually a rule the FDA would like you to follow and keep for at least 2 years. So items that cannot be specifically tested for would be things dietary fiber, added sugar, folate, and vitamin E. And there's some sort of more complex reasons for the final two. But keep in mind, we're gonna talk a little bit more about this in our third webinar when we go through a full transition from an old to a new label. But and we would like to start thinking about with your teams what would be the best way for you as a manufacturer to document this information. All right, I think we're going to move over into some question and answer period, and my friend Ben here is here to help with that.
All right, thank you, Maya. That was a great overview here. We're going to take a look at some of the questions that we've gotten here. Just so that you know, if we don't get to any of your questions during this time, we'll get back to you later. You can also contact us. Our phone number and the email address are on this page that you see now. We also have some helpful resources. We have our blog. If you go to esha.com and go to our blog page, we have a lot of information about all of the new changes, fibers, added sugars, all that kind of stuff. We have our LinkedIn page and our e-newsletter that goes out. We're going to take a look at, we do have in that blog, we do have information on the % daily value changes. We'll also send that information out after this webinar in the follow-up email that we'll send out to everyone that signed up for this webinar. We'll go into a few questions here. First question, how do we build added sugars in Genesis? How will we know what is added versus naturally occurring?
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, so as we mentioned, we have populated these fields in Genesis when we can. So anything that's USDA and also items outside of that. So if it is something that's obviously either naturally occurring or an added sugar, we have made that change for you. However, if it is something that's user added ingredient, you will need to determine if it's added sugar or naturally occurring. And again, sort of the process there is think about the source, think about how it's being used and in what concentration. And of course, we can help you through specific questions you may have regarding your ingredients.
All right, another question pertaining to added sugars as well. What constitutes as added sugar? What if the grain we enzymatically treat breaks down sugars from the grain? Is that considered added sugar if the sugar comes from the grain itself?
Ooh, good question. So in this case, no, this would not be considered an added sugar because the enzymatic breakdown is happening incidentally rather than with the purpose of creating a sweetener. So the intent of this portion of the rule is really to target sugars that are purposefully and specifically created through enzymatic hydrolysis and not sugars that are created incidentally. The incidental sugars are still going to be captured in the total sugar area, but are not considered added sugars. Thanks for that question.
All right, one more question. How will fibers not considered dietary fiber but with 0 calories be calculated for carbs/net carbs?
Well, dietary fiber that doesn't fit the FDA definition of beneficial fiber cannot be reported as dietary fiber. We've talked about that. However, it is still included in the total carbohydrate makeup. And then from there, calories can be calculated using the 449 method or one of the other 5 methods that are made available and mentioned in the CFR. I hope that's what that question is about there.
All right, we've had this question come up a few times. Can I get a copy of the slide deck that we have seen throughout this webinar? Yes, we will send that out during the follow-up email that we send. They'll also have a copy of the video of this tutorial as well. All right, one more question. Do we still need to maintain old fiber fields or just enter values for the new 2016 fields?
Well, it's kind of something that you guys need to decide. So if you still have the need to create old labels, you'll of course still want to keep those total dietary fiber fields populated. But if you are completely moving forward to the new labels, or in fact maybe you're new to Genesis and starting from scratch, in this case you might want to only go and populate the 2016 dietary fiber fields. So it sort of depends on which nutrition facts panel you're going for.
All right, we'll move a little bit differently in our questions. Can you show me how to turn on the 2016 nutrients in Genesis? So for this, I'll go ahead and actually open Genesis itself up. So inside of Genesis, if you go to the Home tab up here, we have the nutrients to view that you can view. So long as you're using version 11.1, you'll have all the new fields available for you and the new label. So if we go to nutrients to view, we have introduced a couple of new fields here. We have the US label 2016 mandatory and US label 2016 all. If you select one of those as your set of nutrients to view, that will be the nutrients that show up both on any reports that you open as well as when entering an ingredient or going to edit recipe, the nutrients tab there. We can take a look at the recipe here. If we go to edit recipe, in the nutrients tab here, the nutrients that are shown here are the nutrients to view. So I currently have the 2016 all nutrients set here, so we should be seeing the 2016 fibers and added sugars as well. All right, is maltodextrin considered an added sugar?
Another good question. Actually, maltodextrin is a polysaccharide, and the definition only focuses on free, mono, and disaccharides. So, nope, maltodextrin is actually not considered an added sugar.
Great. Next question. It looks like there is no need to create a new ingredient file for user input data. We could just fill out into the added nutrients. Is that correct, Maya?
That is correct, yeah. So if you guys already have ingredients that you've input, there's no need to create a brand new ingredient, but you do want to go in and fill in the correct nutrients that have changed. So fill in any added sugar or dietary fiber, look at the conversion factors that you might need to make with vitamin D and others.
Great, and what about the ESHA database ingredients? How do you update those, Maya?
Well, you can update some information on ESHA ingredients, so certain things like user code, alternate name, allergen, ingredient, statement, and cost. Actually, what you can't update would be nutrient information. The reason for that is that when we would do a new update version, we often update specific ingredients. So say information has come out giving us a new value for vitamin D for a certain ingredient. When you get that update, if you have made a change with a save as and on our ingredient and change the nutrients, that ingredient will no longer be sort of covered by us. We're not going to have access to give you the most up-to-date version of that ingredient. So just a reminder that the things you can change in ESHA items are ingredients, user code, alternate name, allergens, cost. Things you cannot change would be the nutrition information. That way you would need to create your own ingredient with a save as.
Great. Next question. What is the reporting limit for vitamin D on the label?
The reporting limit. Well, there's no maximum for vitamin D as that I know of. However, there's going to be rules based on how it's classified. So the FDA classifies nutrients as either class 1, which is anything that's going to be fortified, minerals that are put in through fortification. Class 2 is ingredients that are more naturally occurring. And then, to kind of talk through in the different cases, so in vitamin D, if it's been put into milk, so it's been fortified in milk, that would be considered a class 1 nutrient in that scenario. And you must have at least 100% of what is stated on your label in your food. So if your food was pulled off, if your milk was pulled off the shelf and tested, because it is fortified with vitamin D, the vitamin D would need to be in at least 100% of what's on the label. However, if something like our bluefin tuna, where we did an example earlier with which naturally contains vitamin D, this would fall into a class 2 classification, and in that case, the vitamin D would need to be in at least 80% of what was on the label in the food. So the bluefin tuna was tested, we would need to have at least 80% of what our label said to be compliant.
Great, thanks Maya. Next question. I did a comparison from an old label to a new label for the same product and noticed that the vitamin percentages were higher. We went over that a little bit during the demo, but could you expand on that a little bit, Maya?
Yeah, so definitely some of the, as we noticed, there's actually been quite a few changes, and on this slide deck we'll provide a link that has a great graphic which shows you all the new mandatory nutrients or new voluntary nutrients, as well as the DV and how those have changed. So look for that in the slide deck.
And we've got that link that shows below the actual blog post that has those comparisons as well. All right, so Maya, you mentioned being able to override nutrient values at the recipe level. We had a couple questions on kind of how that would work and how you can go about doing that. So go ahead and switch over to Genesis again. We'll take a look at that. So inside of your recipe, if you've got your recipe open, if we go to the Edit Recipe button, you can either show it before the search for or in the Recipe tab. You have Edit Recipe up here as well. In the Nutrients tab, you'll see 3 columns here, 4 counting the nutrient name. If you don't see that last column that shows Override, there's a button down below that says Show Analysis Override. You'll want to check that box to be able to do that. And then if you've got an item, I think we were talking a little bit about juice concentrates was a big one where it may or may not count as added sugars, and if it does, you can add your added sugar value to your recipe, overriding the value. So right now we have a 0 value in our recipe for added sugars. We added to, say, 2.14 grams. Now all of the sugar in our recipe is going to be added sugar. So if we go over to our label now, and we'll now see added sugars as 2 grams instead of the 0 as would be calculated based on the ingredients that are added into the recipe. All right, and I think one last question that we've got here, will the program provide documentation for the nutrients described on the last slide? And we're going to cover that a little bit in the next webinar, which will be a couple weeks from now.
And that about wraps it up for us today. We thank you guys so much for joining us. Please make sure to check on our website for all of these resources that are available to you in the meantime. And we look forward to continuing the final webinar of this series with you. Thanks so much and have a great day.